Hi, everyone. I'm Rena Ninan. Thank you for joining us. We began this hour with the latest on the Mueller report. Attorney General William Barr announced Friday that he will make the special counsel's findings public no later than mid-April. Quote, if not sooner. In a letter to Congress, the Attorney General said the White House will not see the findings before they're released. Barr said portions of the report containing grand jury details or sensitive intelligence will all be redacted. Barr said that the report is nearly 400 pages long. On Friday, President Trump said he would welcome the full release of the report.
Well, I have great confidence in the Attorney General, and if that's what he'd like to do, I have nothing to hide. This was a hoax. This was a witch hunt. I have absolutely nothing to hide, and I think a lot of things are coming out with respect to the other side, but I have a lot of confidence in the Attorney General.
Julia Manchester's a reporter for The Hill. She joins me now from Washington. Okay, so Julia, William Barr said he's going to reportedly testify. He announced this in a letter before the Senate and House Judiciary Committee early May. But House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler is sticking to his April 2nd deadline for an unredacted report. Clearly, we're not going to meet this deadline. How do you see this playing out on Capitol Hill?
You know, I think there's going to be a lot of push and pull between Capitol Hill and the Justice Department. It's only going to end up in more pressure between the two sides on this. You know, we've seen that Democrats really from the get-go really set the April 2nd deadline. Ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Dianne Feinstein, set an April 1st deadline. So I think William Barr knew what he was walking into. However, from his point of view, there is lots of information in this nearly 400-page report that includes national security concerns as well as information that could be politically damaging to some officials. So from his perspective, there might have been nitpicking things that he needed to take out in order to make the report appropriate for the public. However, Democrats are in a very tough spot. I think they were really banking on something damaging towards the president to come out in this report. However, if William Barr is really sending out this heavily redacted letter, they're not going to get that information that can really allow them to save face for putting so much faith in this report and putting so much faith in the fact that maybe President Trump, there was some sort of connection between his campaign and the Russia, which there wasn't, according to the report.
And I should say the DOJ is saying that, you know, these redactions are to protect sources, methods, grand jury testimony, things that they just don't want out there. I do want to pivot, though, really quickly to immigration and the border. The president spoke about his plans for the border. I want to play that bite for you.
Mexico is doing very well because of the United States, and frankly, they have to stop the illegal immigration. We've run out of room. Mexico is going to have to do something, otherwise I'm closing the border. I'll just close the border. And with a deficit like we have with Mexico and have had for many years, closing the border will be a profit-making operation.
I'll just close the border. Can the president do that unilaterally?
Well, you know, it's going to be pretty difficult for him at this point. He's already declared that state of emergency at the border in order to construct his border wall. And we see that on Capitol Hill going through the House. This kind of measure obviously wouldn't pass. So I would imagine there could maybe be some sort of national security consideration that would have to be put into this move. However, Rena, one important point I'd like to point out is the future of USMCA, the renegotiation of NAFTA, and how this plays into this. You know, USMCA, you know, is going through Congress right now, and it's facing some hurdles from Democrats. So I don't think this necessarily makes Mexico or even Canada happy that President Trump is shutting down the border, because if this impacts the movement of human travel or goods coming across the Mexican border into the United States and vice versa, you know, that's going to put that deal in peril as well. So lots of things to really look out for in all of this.
You know, you talk about the national security implications, but, you know, what also about economic? What does this mean for trade?
You know, going back to USMCA, I think it just puts quite a bit of tension between trade between the U.S. and Mexico, as well as Canada, looping in this whole USMCA deal. And, you know, I think President Trump has really imposed these not necessarily protectionist measures, but measures that sort of almost close the U.S. out from trade with other nations, or maybe sort of aim to, you know, not going quite that far. However, I would say that trade relations under the Trump administration have become tense protectionist with other countries and the rhetoric President Trump has put out with other countries and blocs such as the European Union and China. So I think the U.S. has to be very, very careful with how it really negotiates this path in terms of trade, given that Mexico and Canada, some of our biggest trade partners, could be very much impacted by this.
I want to turn now to 2020. We just had this drop on Friday afternoon. Former Democratic candidate for lieutenant governor in Nevada, Lucy Flores, wrote a first-person essay in New York Magazine. And in it, she alleges that former Vice President Joe Biden smelled her hair, kissed the back of her head before a speech at a campaign event. And we should note, Flores is currently working for a PAC that's supporting Bernie Sanders. A spokesperson for Biden said that the former VP doesn't recall the interaction and wishes Flores the best. Do you think this could derail Biden's 2020 campaign even before it formally kicks off?
You know, I don't know if it will necessarily derail it. However, it does raise some questions in the era of Me Too. You know, this kind of behavior, even back in 2014, I think, unfortunately, was swept under the rug in a lot of campaigns and other workplaces. However, the Me Too movement has really pushed this sort of behavior to the forefront and saying that it's not acceptable in the workplace. And reading that op-ed by Lucy Flores, there was one line that struck me in particular. It said if she was working in a corporation or a business, she would just go to HR and complain there. However, on the campaign trail and within campaigns, there really is no formal structure a lot of the time to deal with that sort of thing. So I think this op-ed, as well as other people we've seen come forward, you know, we saw a staffer in Kirsten Gillibrand's office anonymously talk about the culture there, even though Gillibrand has, you know, looked into that since. But, you know, I think this really sets a precedent for how congressional offices as well as campaigns handle the issue of sexual assault and really, or sexual misconduct, and really create an infrastructure that allows individuals to come forward comfortably and share their experiences, and that, you know, the appropriate action should be taken. It's worth noting that Lucy Flores, obviously at the time this happened, the second most powerful man in the country, one of the most powerful men in the world did that, so I can't imagine how she felt. However, I think this does set a precedent for how future campaigns deal with this.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and something the Biden camp certainly can't ignore at this point. Finally, I want to ask you about 2020 candidate Amy Klobuchar, Minnesota Democrat running. She announced a $1 trillion infrastructure plan this year. We heard earlier in the week from South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott saying it's not going to happen this session on infrastructure. So despite what the president has said on this issue, who wants to move forward, can the issue of infrastructure move the needle for the Democratic Party primary voters?
It could potentially. I think infrastructure is seen as a very bipartisan issue. So in the primary, I mean, I don't think it's going to be as hot of an issue as something like the Green New Deal, which is something that very much, you know, speaks to the progressive base. However, going into the general election, I could see that happening because we've seen, you know, the White House try to, in Democrats in Congress, kind of try to at least talk about this issue. However, I would say it's not as hot of an issue as other issues such as healthcare or environmental concerns. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in the primary. However, I think a lot of Republicans are going to attack this plan because it really takes aim at the heart of those Trump tax cuts and would like to essentially reverse them in order to pay for infrastructure. And I think a lot of Republicans would have an issue with a plan like that if it were to advance to the general election.
Before you go, I want to ask you, if potentially, is this the end for Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos? You remember she defunded a budget proposal to cut funding for Special Olympics, something the president then later reversed this week. So when you talk about her, there's rumblings that the president's unhappy with her. Is this the end of her administration?
Rena, it's really hard to say that because I think we questioned that with former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who stayed on for so long until he finally left his position, and the president was constantly publicly attacking him. I mean, we've seen that DeVos and the president had two different messaging strategies on this issue, which clearly conflicted in the public eye. However, it's hard for me to say whether this is the end, but I think, you know, DeVos has had a series of, I guess, public blunders, you know, ever since her confirmation hearings and how she's talked about education. I think she's come across as very out of touch to American voters. And I don't think the Trump administration necessarily wants a figure like that on the president's cabinet going into 2020 and trying to appeal to swing American voters. So it's hard to say whether this is the end, but it's not looking good.
Julia Manchester, thank you for joining us, Julia.
Thank you.